Okay, so good evening, everybody. Um, and so the title of my talk tonight is American Orthodoxy Confronts Contemporary Society. And there have been, as I've written about and spoken about in the last few weeks, there are basically two issues that in a way are still kind of going on. Um, where the values and mores of the Orthodox community are in conflict with the values and mores and, in some sense, legal obligation of general society. All right. So one is the case of Yeshiva University versus the YU Pride Alliance. The other is the situation that's going on in New York State with Hasidic yeshivas not meeting basic educational standards. Okay. And most of you, in fact, all of you, have been in at least some of my classes before. So, and forgive me, but, this is what I do. I'm going to start with a little history. And the reason that I'm going to start with a little history is because those of us who are not Orthodox often look at the Orthodox community as if it's, all of, one cloth, but it is definitely not. And going back even really to the 1800s, there have been two different types of orthodoxy. And that started really in Germany, which is not surprising because non-Orthodox movements as movements started in Germany. Right now, we will often say or hear that, up until a certain point in time, all Jews were Orthodox. I do not believe that to be the case, because Orthodoxy arose as a reaction to reform. And, in the same sense that, before Christianity started to splinter, nobody called themselves Catholic, they were just Christian, right? But then they were Catholic or Orthodox, and then Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant. They were just Jews. But when a reforming movement started, then the other Jews who were not part of that needed a label too. But within Germany, there were two types of orthodoxy. Okay. And I don't speak German, but I know words that you have to learn to learn Jewish history. There was Einheitsgemeinde Orthodoxy and Austritt Orthodoxy. Okay. So in Germany, because there was no separation of religion and state, so in Germany, there's still no separation of religion and state. So you were registered as part of a community, and some of your tax dollars went to that community. And the Einheitsgemeinde means the unity community or the unified community. So within the same communal structure, there were Reform synagogues and Reform rabbis, and Orthodox synagogues and Orthodox rabbis. And then when Samson Raphael Hirsch in like the 1840s felt that it was not possible for Orthodox Jews to be part of the same communal structure as Reform Jews. So he started a movement called Austritt, which means like outside. And so within Germany, up until really the Shoah, there were two types of Orthodoxy. There was Einheitsgemeinde Orthodoxy, who were part of the larger community, and Austritt, who were not. And then in Eastern Europe, when Napoleon was attacking the Russian Empire, right? And even though Napoleon was a dictator and not the greatest person, et cetera, he brought with him the same ideals as the French Revolution. And wherever Napoleon's armies got, Jewish emancipation got, meaning that Jews were considered citizens and not merely subjects. So as the Napoleonic armies were attacking the Russian Empire, the question came, should Jews pray for Napoleon's victory or not? And most Jews said, yeah, because he's going to free us from this oppression, right? But Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was the founder of Chabad, said, no. We need to pray for the Tsar, because if Napoleon wins, he's going to tear down the ghetto walls, right? And you may think that's great, but it's not great, because the abolition of the ghetto is going to lead to assimilation. All right, so he supported the Tsar and not Napoleon. And then in 1912, there was an organization founded in Poland originally called Agudat Yisrael, or Agudas Yisrael, I suppose they probably pronounced it. And the goal was to unite all of those elements of Orthodoxy that were opposed to Zionism, and wanted to basically isolate from the rest of Jewry. So that meant the Hasidim, the Lithuanian yeshivas, and German Austric Orthodoxy as well. Okay, even though in many ways that German Austric Orthodoxy was culturally very, very different, because to this day, if you go like the Breuer congregation in Washington Heights, which is the successor to that, I mean, they love opera, they read Goethe, et cetera, but they are religiously still isolated from the rest of the community. Okay, so this division into two types of orthodoxy really continues in the United States. Okay, between what we might call modern orthodoxy and Haredi orthodoxy, recognizing that everything is a spectrum, right? And there are a lot of people who are sort of have a foot in the modern Orthodox camp and a foot in the Haredi camp. Okay, but the hallmarks of modern Orthodoxy is the belief that one can and should participate in American society, and that does not necessitate religious compromise. Okay, so you will find, I mean, Yeshiva University for sure has been the flagship, and the slogan of Yeshiva University is Torah Umada, which means Torah and science, but science in the academic sense. It doesn't just mean like biology or chemistry. It means, all of secular learning. All right. But it's not limited to Yeshiva University. I mean, there's a flourishing Orthodox community at the University of Maryland. There are flourishing Orthodox communities at most of the Ivies, certainly the urban Ivies, right? Columbia, Yale, Harvard, Penn, Princeton to some extent, not so much at Dartmouth, because it's more, there's not the larger Jewish infrastructure to support that, right? But the University of Michigan has a large Orthodox population. I mean, you wouldn't, I mean, Orthodox Jews tend to be concentrated among a fairly small number of universities because they require a certain infrastructure, right? They require kosher dining, enough other Orthodox students to make sure that there's minyanim, to make sure that there's, learning opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. But, they believe that you can, participate in American society, right? Whereas the Haredi community are more, let's say, in America, but not of America, right? So, and that is divided between what's known as the yeshivish, which are the non-Hasidic Haredi, mostly of Lithuanian extraction, and then the Hasidim. The yeshivish community might fall if modern Orthodox is Torah Umada, then yeshivish is Torah ufarnasa, right? Torah and parnasa, right? Torah and making a living, right? What's the difference between Torah umada and Torah ufarnasa? Is that they recognize that, in order to make a living in American society, right, higher education is a necessity, right? But what are the type of professions that yeshivish people would fall into? I mean, you want to go to college and major in business? Great, right? You want to go to college and be a pre-med? Great. You want to go to college and be pre-law? Okay, but probably you don't want to go to Yale or Harvard, right? You probably want to go to, night law school someplace because, but you want to major in English, at best a waste of time. Beyond that, probably spiritually dangerous, right? Chemistry, biology, fine. Theoretical astrophysics, not fun, right? Going to challenge, the age of the universe, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so, whatever is necessary. You want to be a lawyer, you want to be an accountant. Accountant is a great profession. If you're, if you're a Haredi, it doesn't not spiritually challenging in any way. You can be a, computer programmer. I notice in Baltimore, there's a lot of Orthodox occupational therapists and physical therapists. Those are the kind of professions, right? Whereas, so they are less isolated, and the Hasidic community is much more isolationist, and they in general frown on higher education at all. Okay, whereas like the yeshivish yeshivas, like, if you go to one of these yeshivas in Brooklyn, you can go to Brooklyn College or Queens College at the same time and get a degree. Okay, Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, all of their classes, the yeshiva classes are in the day, and you can go to UMBC or maybe even Hopkins, although more like mostly they're soon go to UMBC, but that's fine. And Ner Yisrael is, encourages you to get a secular education as long as it's not at the expense of your Torah learning. Okay, so this is like the sort of map of American Orthodoxy, right? So let's go to the Yeshiva University versus YU Pride case. So Yeshiva, as I mentioned, is the flagship of modern Orthodoxy. It started as a yeshiva in the 1880s on the Lower East Side. It moved uptown, and I think in the 1920s, it started what was known as Yeshiva College. Okay, but since then, it's grown into a major research university, okay, with all that implies, okay? So that Yeshiva University has a law school, right? The Cardozo Law School, a good law school. I mean, it's not a top 10, but it's a good law school. And like the Innocence Project started at Cardozo Law School and still run out of Cardozo Law School. They had a medical school until very recently, the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Like many research universities, it spun off its hospital and its med school because it couldn't absorb the deficits that it was running. So now it's Montefiore Hospital and the med school are separate. But up until very recently, it was YU had a medical school. It has a school of social work. It has a business school. It has a school of education. It has a secular grad school, meaning you can go to YU and get a degree, a master's or PhD in English or biology or physics or whatever. And it has men's and women's undergraduate programs, Stern College for women and Yeshiva College for men, and also a rabbinical school, known as REITS, the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. Now, the graduate programs, with the exception of REITS, are not only in theory secular, they are in fact secular. Students of all backgrounds and all persuasions go there. The only difference between, let's say, Cardozo and NYU is that Cardozo is closed on Shabbos and Yontif, and the cafeteria is kosher. But other than that, you would not know that you were in an Orthodox or a Jewish institution. Yeshiva College and Stern College are, in theory, non-sectarian, but they require so many hours of Jewish study that I don't think they have any non-Jewish students. But in theory, you could go there. But they do have behaviors that they enforce on campus, especially in the dorms, Shabbos, kashrus, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, the rabbinical school is a rabbinical school, right? I mean, it runs under Orthodox norms. Now, what happened with Yeshiva University, which is why this whole lawsuit was possible in the first place, in that around 1968 or 1970, New York State made state money available to colleges and universities, but not to religious colleges and universities. And they paid each university, they gave a certain amount per capita for every degree that was issued. And so Yeshiva University changed its charter from a religious institution to an educational institution. Yeshiva was not unique. Fordham University did exactly the same thing at the same time for the same reason. Fordham University being a Catholic and Jesuit university. And at the time, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of REITS and, sort of if you could say there was a chief rabbi of American modern Orthodoxy, it was him, said, this is a bad idea. This is a bad idea because it's gonna, with the right, I mean, in Hebrew, it's Baal Hamea, Baal Hadeya, And in English, we say what? You know, he who pays the piper calls the tune, right? And that, money never comes without strings attached, right? And we are going to be forced to sell our soul for it. Now, interestingly, the graduate programs, I mean, I think it was Cardozo, has had an LGBT student group since 1995. And Rabbi Norman Lamb, who is 2 presidents ago of Yeshiva University, recognized them, and he was attacked from the right. And remember, I mean, if you like think of LGBT acceptance in 1995 versus 2022, right? I mean, a chasm, right, in terms of societal attitudes, right? But he said, we got no choice, right? We're a secular school, and we have to do this. But in 2022, when the Undergraduate Pride Alliance sought recognition, it was denied. And the Pride Alliance went to court, won, and the trial, the New York State trial court said New York State human rights ordinance requires, you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of orientation. You have to give them the same rights and the same funding as any other undergraduate club. And then YU went to the Supreme Court, applied for an emergency injunction, which was denied. And the reason that it was denied is because, I mean, as I understand it, the general principle is that the Supreme Court is a court of last resort. And they had not exhausted all of their options in the New York State court system, right? In other words, their application to the Supreme Court was essentially premature. And so the Supreme Court said, we're not going to give you your injunction. Go back to the state, exhaust your appeals at that point. And then, if you go through the New York courts and lose, you can come back to us. So Yeshiva University said, fine, right? I mean, presumably they have good lawyers who know how to read, and I mean, rabbis know how to read too, right? Read things very narrowly. And said, you must treat the Pride Alliance the same way you treat all other clubs. So they said, fine, we will treat them the same way we treat all other clubs. So no more clubs. And that way we're not discriminating against them. We're not discriminating against them because we're not denying them on the basis of orientation something that we give to other students, right? No clubs for anybody. At which point, the Pride Alliance went to the New York State courts and said, we will agree to a stay on this ruling until it's played out in the courts, because we don't want to be the reason that our fellow students can't have clubs. And the judge said okay, and YU said okay, and so that's where the legal thing stands right now. The reaction has been, I guess what you might expect, right? Lots and lots of support from evangelicals, lots and lots of support from the Haredi community, which generally views YU as trafe. Um, you know, but circumstances make strange bedfellows, right? Um, the flip side is that there's been a petition of alumni against the decision of the president. The president is current president Rabbi Ari Berman, um, and signed by well over 1,000 alumni. There's a petition signed by over 200 faculty members, opposing the Rabbi Berman's decision. And the faculty are basically saying, essentially, and this is true. I mean, YU is considered a top-notch major research university, right? And we are considered a top-notch major research university because we play in the same playground and we have academic freedom. And in making this decision, you are threatening the reputation of Yeshiva University in the academic community, right? Students will not want to come here. Faculty will not want to come here. I mean, it's a university. It's not, it's not a shul, right? And but at the same time, I mean, Yeshiva University has gotten all kinds of support from, let's say, the usual suspects on Fox News, and and the Ted Cruzes and Marco Rubios of the world. And the question is really, what is Rabbi Berman up to? Okay, what is Rabbi Berman up to? Because the alumni petition and the faculty petition have made it very clear that, look, this is not a halachic question, right? I mean, as I said in one of my drashot, right, it is quite clear that orthodoxy forbids homosexual sexual behaviors. Okay, there is no prohibition against having a certain orientation, right? There may be a prohibition against acting on that orientation, depending on, where you stand on some of these issues, but there's no prohibition on having a certain orientation. There's no prohibition on saying, I am gay, all right? And there is no real prohibition, really, against even two men or two women living together as companions, even though they may be prohibited in theory from certain sexual behaviors or whatever. But one presumes that these forbidden behaviors are not occurring at the meetings of the Pride Alliance, right? In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, you have students who are saying, I need a place where I can discuss with other gay Orthodox students the challenge of being gay and Orthodox, right? And, it's very easy, like somebody like me, I'm going to say to such a person, come join us, right? Where it's not an issue. Come join us where it's not an issue. And you be as observant as you want, right? There's no prohibition about being fully observant. And being conservative, but they say, no, we are Orthodox. We want to be part of the community in which we were raised and in which we identify, right? But so why is Yeshiva University doing what they're doing, which, to at first glance, I think to many people seems both halachically unnecessary and kind of gratuitously cruel. All right. So what's going on? I have my own theory, and this is just my own theory. But let me stop here for a moment. And, first of all, if there are questions or comments. And second of all, if anybody else wants to, throw in on what the heck is going on and why. Anyone? Mike, I see your lips moving, but you're muted. Okay. All right. So here is what I think. I think that this has, nothing to do with halacha, and it has quite a lot to do with Israel and the culture wars in the United States. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we are a balkanized country, right? There is a red America and there is a blue America, okay? For better or for worse. And red America is pretty much solidly pro-Israel. I mean, even though there are certainly people who flirt with or more than flirt with anti-Semitism, in red America. I mean, I think the Kanye West case, right? They were all, yay, Kanye West, until he came out with his anti-Semitic stuff. And then someone said, maybe not, right? But the modern Orthodox community is, not only solidly pro-Israel, but pretty much solidly pro-Likud. I want to say solidly because it's not 100%, but it's 75%. I mean, if you look at the voting patterns, I mean, whereas 80% of American Jews on the whole vote Democratic, it's not 80% of modern Orthodox who vote Republican, but it's way higher than 20%. Okay. And I think Yeshiva University has simply made a choice to throw in with red America on the culture war stuff. And whether this is going to prove to be a smart move or a foolish move, time will tell. But I really think that and this is not only my own thought. I mean, I see this a lot from people who know that community a lot better than I do, that this is on the background of U.S. culture wars and tribalism. Okay. Any questions or comments? Okay. So Alan, got to unmute. Yeah.
Really, this has been very interesting so far. And then the only thing I've understood really is you got to exhaust your administrative, your remedies. But I don't understand why, unless it's a fundraising thing or something elemental like that, why would they throw in with Fox News? How does that really help if you're an academic community and you really are there for intellectual curiosity?
It's a good question, and to me, I have to say it's inexplicable. But I think that their assumption is, and I think it's, by the way, a bad assumption that this is what their alumni want. And I personally, I think it's a bad assumption. I think it's not an accurate assumption. Mike.
Yeah, first off, Yasher Koach, because what you just routinely spout, I don't think is known to a tenth of a percent of American Jews. I mean, when I was a kid, it never occurred to me to research the different standards and whatnot of the different colleges. It just never was even on my radar. And you know this like a miniature Wikipedia. So my question is, armed, which you'll have to accept is unusual, armed as you are, would it be unseemly to be talking to you personally, to be talking to the heads of Yeshiva University, because you understand the stuff and there's some really important questions that need answering. And I'm not sure there's many people in the country that have the capacity
Well,
to ask or understand answers.
all right, there's more than you think, but having said that, if this were 3 or 4 years ago, I would have that conversation because the prior president of Yeshiva University was a friend of mine. Richard Joel. Richard Joel was the international director of Hillel before he became the president of Yeshiva University. Okay, I spent 2 Shabbatot in his family's home in Kemp Mill. And I would run into him every now and then, and it was always Rabbi Arian, even though he's Orthodox, and give me a big hug and whatever. And I would have had I would have had the access to him and to have this conversation. But I haven't told you anything that Ari Berman doesn't know. And Ari Berman is not interested in what I have to say. I mean, because I'm not part of his community, and I have no political power and no, if I was a rabbi of a big conservative shul in New York State, maybe, right? Because but I mean, I I'm flattered by your suggestion, but it's Gornish Telford.
Because you
There's no
see
there
it as the door opens politically and not intellectually.
I think so. I mean, Ari Berman is not a stupid guy, and I just think he's made a certain decision to throw in with one side of the culture wars, and I mean, time will tell whether that's a bad bet or not, right? I mean, I would say one thing that is true across the board of the Orthodox community is that first of all, they may believe that non-Orthodox forms of Judaism have a utilitarian function. That is to say that, recognizing that not everybody's going to be Orthodox, and that people who grow up not Orthodox sometimes become Orthodox, right? But that's not going to happen if they don't even know they're Jewish, right? If they have no Jewish background whatsoever, so that it's better to be conservative or reform or reconstructionist than to be completely secular. So that we may have a utilitarian value, but we have no true spiritual value. And that by 2050, 2060, they are going to be the majority of the American Jewish community. That they are having many kids and keeping them in the fold, we're having few kids and not keeping them in the fold. So they believe that they are the future. I, you know, I don't anticipate being around in 2050, 2060. So I won't know, but that's what they think. I think for sure. All right. So let's move on to the Hasidic yeshivas. Okay. So a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times had a very large, it was more than a couple of weeks ago, it was on Sunday, September 11th, a front page expose on the performance of Hasidic schools, which, revealed, among other things, that the Hasidic schools scored lower than any other group on state standardized tests. Okay. Having said that, there is some scuttlebutt in the community that was on purpose, right? Because there is additional state money available for low performing schools. So let's have our kids do poorly on the tests and we'll get more state money. Okay. Do I know if that's true? I have no idea. But having said that, it's not impossible. Okay. Because here's what this is my perspective, but I believe it is accurate, is that, if you go back 100, 150 years to the Tsarist Empire, right? Would anybody say that it was morally wrong to cheat the Tsarist government, right? I would not say so, right? The problem is that attitude has been brought to America, right? And that it's not morally wrong to cheat the federal and state governments either, right? So whatever can be done to get more money for the community is fine. So that if that means telling your kids to fail tests, and that way we'll get money for failing schools, great, right? But having said that, I don't think that was really, whether it was the case or not, I don't know, but it's not necessary. Anyone who is familiar with this community knows that many Hasidim are functionally illiterate in English, right? This is simply fact. I live one neighborhood over from Borough Park, okay, when I was a kid in Kensington, and still have family in Brooklyn. Kelly and I have gone to Borough Park, gone to Williamsburg, gone to Crown Heights, and you go into Hasidic-owned stores, and people there, if they speak English at all, is with a very thick accent, right? And then you say, "Oh, where are you from?" "I was born here." "Okay, but my parents were born here." They're third generation Americans and can barely function in English. Okay, and at worst, at best, this is because they don't think secular studies are worthwhile. All right, which is why very often you'll find that the women are better educated than the men, because the men are learning Torah, Torah, Torah. The women who support the family, and they have to be able to function in English better than the men do, because they're going to have to do so. Judy, did you have something you wanted to say?
I'm trying to understand their thinking, and I have a hard time because, and I know it's true actually, that in many of these religious schools, because I test people,
Right.
That was my that was my profession, and I've tested some children from those schools. I was completely shocked by the lack of knowledge. And I felt the thing that I felt was, how could they allow this for their children? How did they do have to live in a world? And so that's where I have this difficulty. And I guess maybe with Yeshiva University going sort of right wing, it seems more right wing to me to not educate your children. And just because you're going to a school doesn't mean, apparently, unbeknownst to me, that you're not educated or being educated.
Now, look, Yeshiva University is a different case altogether. I mean, people get their undergraduate degrees from Yeshiva College or Stern, go on to Harvard Law School,
Right,
Yale Law School,
right.
et cetera. I mean, it's not, I mean, they're getting a good education. The question is, will they continue to get a good education if Yeshiva University becomes sort of more sectarian, right? But like I said, I mean, you can view it as simply a decision that teaching secular studies is not worth the time that it takes away from learning Torah, or you can view it as an intentional move to keep kids in the community, right? I mean, if you can't function in English, you don't know basic math, et cetera, it becomes really very, very hard to leave the community, okay? And both in the United States and in Israel, there are organizations that are devoted to providing resources to people who want to leave the community and don't have the wherewithal to function outside of it, okay? Mike, you want to
Yeah,
say?
I just want to make sure everybody has in their mind, the rabbi has put two issues before us. One is the Yeshiva University and its attitude toward LGBTQ, and the other is inadequacy of secular education in the facility. And they're totally different, as I understand it, as the
Right, they
rabbi
are.
has explained to me before. And we need to keep them separate, or you don't know what you're talking about, because it's so easy to lump Yeshiva University into the category of inadequate secular, and it ain't who they are.
Right,
And
no,
there are yeshivas. I mean, I went to yeshiva as a kid, a little kid, but in Williamsburg and Borough Park, but they were not Haredi yeshivas. And so when I went back into public school, I was, better educated at that time than my secular classmates. So,
right.
But you got to keep these things separate. One is the Haredi approach to yeshivas, which doesn't want to waste time on secular, or doesn't think, or it's scared of it, whatever the reasons. And the other is the Yeshiva U and its attitude toward LGBTQ. But that's
Right.
They're separate. You just
Right.
have to keep it
Right,
in your
they're
head.
two very different communities and very different issues. I mean, if you look at modern Orthodox yeshivas, okay, if you look at, let's say, Berman Hebrew Academy here in Rockville,
Mhm.
right? I mean, their graduates have as good a secular education as anybody else, okay? Or the Maimonides School in Brookline, or the Yeshiva of Flatbush, okay? Or Ramaz, okay? On the Upper East Side, okay? Or the Kushner Yeshiva Academy who's named after the grandmother of Jared Kushner, right? Jared Kushner graduated from that school, and then his father bought him admission to Harvard University. I mean, these places are not lacking in secular education, right? I mean, and if they were lacking, they wouldn't get the students that they get, right? Because, I mean, and this is relevant, right? The wealthiest identifiable subgroup in American society are the modern Orthodox. Okay. And it's partly a chicken and egg question. I mean, it is incredibly expensive to be modern Orthodox. Incredibly expensive, right? I mean, you've got yeshiva day school tuition for 2, 4, 6 kids. You've got camp for 2, 4, 6 kids. You've got to live within an eruv, within walking distance to the Orthodox shul, right? And you guys know, right, as realtors, that being within the eruv is a premium on the value of the house, right? I mean, so, I mean, $250,000 is like poor in these communities, right? I mean, it's incredibly expensive to be modern Orthodox, and therefore you have to be able to make a good living, which means you need a good education, right? I mean, so, but in the Haredi community, I mean, it's expensive to be Haredi too, but not as expensive because they're not going to college, right? And but the attitude towards secular education. I mean, I had a discussion once, I just tell you, with a guy that I knew when I was the Hillel director at UVA. Okay, this was a guy. He was a Baal Teshuva, meaning somebody who didn't grow up Orthodox, who became Orthodox, but in his case, Haredi Orthodox, not modern Orthodox. Okay, but his undergraduate degree was from Brown. His law degree was from UVA. He practices with a really top-notch law firm in Baltimore. But he's not Hasidic, but he's part of the yeshivish Haredi community. And there are 2 Orthodox, like Black Hat Orthodox day schools for boys in Baltimore. There's Talmudical Academy and Torah Institute, TA and TI. And his kids go to TI. And I asked him, I said, because I had Shabbos lunch at his house when I lived in Baltimore, I said, what's the difference between the 2 schools? Because I really didn't know. He said, TI only has the state mandated minimum of secular studies. So that's why I send my kids there. And I mean, it's like you went to Brown and UVA law school and you make boatloads of money because of this education, and you purposely send your kids to a school that has the the bare minimum of required secular education. To
What
me,
did you
that's,
say to the guy when he said that to you?
I mean, I was dumbfounded. I was dumbfounded, but that's his choice. I mean,
Did he show you the door?
no, not at all. No, not at all. And he's a nice guy, but and I mean, I mentioned to him also, and it's shocking to me, but my office in Baltimore was across the street from the house where F. Scott Fitzgerald lived when he wrote The Great Gatsby. And he said to me, I got a lot of spiritual benefit from reading Fitzgerald when I was in college, but I don't want my kids to read him. And, I mean, what can I tell you, right? But so and so there was all kind of, oh, this is anti-Semitism, it's this, that, it's not. I mean, the fact of the matter is these schools don't do a good job of providing a secular education to their kids. And I am agnostic on the question of whether it's simply because they don't believe it's worth the time or because they actively discourage secular education. I mean, if I think about the guy that I was talking about who sent his kids to TI, I think it was really not opposition to secular education per se, as much as it's not as important as Torah study. And so, it's not, if I have, there are only so many hours in the day, and you got to make choices. And he's certainly right about that. You do, right? But the question is priority. But I mean, the question that again, so, I mean, so evangelicals and Catholics have taken up the cudgels for the Hasidic community and saying, everybody should have the right to make a decision how to raise their kids, and this is a threat to school choice. All right, I'm bracketing the question of whether it's okay to take state money for secular education and then not do secular education, right? Which I think, I would have to say is not okay, right? But the question that I really, have less firm feeling about is, do parents have the right to make decisions for their children that may handicap them in participating in general society, right? Because this is not just Hasidic, right? I mean, the same Jews who have very little use for Hasidim tend to romanticize the Amish, right? But the Amish won a case at the Supreme Court in 1972, Wisconsin versus Yoder, which held that the Amish cannot be forced to send their kids to school beyond 8th grade. Okay. And it is for the same reason. A, secular studies are not that important. And B, secular studies provide them a tool to leave the community if they want to leave the community. Right. And the Supreme Court held that their First Amendment rights to religious freedom trumped the state of Wisconsin's interest in making sure that these kids get a good secular education. I mean, one of the differences is that Amish schools in principle don't take government money at all.
Right.
A second difference is that the Amish by and large do not vote. I mean, it's not per se forbidden, but it's discouraged, and only about 7% of Amish vote. Whereas the Hasidic community voter participation is 100% or close to it, and it's a block vote. Okay, the Rebbe of the particular Hasidic community says this is who you're voting for, and that's who you vote for. Okay, and unlike the modern Orthodox community, which is increasingly Republican, the Hasidic community, even though it's culturally conservative, in New York, they tend to vote Democratic anyway, for a couple of reasons. First of all, in New York City, just like Montgomery County, right? I mean, if you want to decide who is going to be your county council member, you have to register as a Democrat and vote in the Democratic primary, because that is de facto the general election. The same is true in New York City, right? The Democratic primary is the de facto general election. But Hasidim tend to be more open to voting Democratic than modern Orthodox. Why is this? Why? Because they depend on social welfare programs, right? They depend on food stamps, they depend on welfare, they depend on Medicaid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to cut these government spending programs is not so popular in that community as it might be in the modern Orthodox community, because it's literally taking money out of their pockets, right? So they have, among the poorest census tracts in the country are Kiryas Yoel, for example, which is a Hasidic town in Rockland County, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The highest level of Medicaid, food stamps, et cetera, et cetera. So they do, which gives them, since they are concentrated in New York State, gives them more political clout in some ways even than the modern Orthodox community does. So yeah, Alan.
Rabbi, I'm still hung up on Yeshiva University. I mean, you're sort of describing Liberty University, really, without a football team. But do they have codes of conduct on campus? You can't hold hands with anybody. You can't do this. You can't do that. Not quite headscarves, but almost.
Well, headscarves wouldn't matter because most of the female students are single. Look, you don't know the geography, right? Yeshiva College is in Washington Heights. Stern is in Midtown Manhattan. Okay, so there's not, and that's not by accident. Okay, that's not by accident. Whereas the graduate program, many of the graduate programs are also in Washington Heights, although, some of them are in the Bronx, I think. I'm not sure where Cardozo is. But they don't have these codes of conduct. But for the undergraduates, they would, but they're not so necessary, really, because there's a bigger separation of the genders than there is at a place like Liberty or, Brigham Young or someplace like that. So. All right. Anything else?
That's wacko. Here I am with my son, who is still a bachelor in rural North Carolina, and I would give either hand, you pick it, to have him surrounded by Jewish women. And here's Yeshiva U going out of its way to keep them apart.
Right, but they don't, look, there is, the ethos of marrying young in that community is very strong. Okay, so that there are social networks that connect people, right? So there's not that same need to just sort of, you marry people that you happen to run into. Okay, but you have, the ethos against sort of casual fraternization, and that is across the board in the Orthodox community, is very strong. It's like, I'll tell you something, which, so the VOD in Washington, right? That has a, the main kosher certifying agency, has a reputation. I mean, it was more so when Rabbi Einemer was still alive. He's passed away. There's other rabbis in charge of it now, but has a reputation of being very, very difficult to deal with. Right? They do not see their job as increasing the kosher restaurants in the community. Quite the opposite, right? Why? Because you don't want teens hanging out at the pizza shop on Saturday night after Shabbos, right? Because, right, you put teenage boys and teenage girls together in the pizza shop, not under adult supervision. Who knows what could happen, right? So, I heard an Orthodox rabbi say, look, I understand that there has to be one kosher restaurant in every town because people travel on business and they need to eat, right? But more than one you don't really need, because women should be at home cooking for their husbands and men should be at home eating their wives' cooking. We don't need lots of restaurants. Okay, it has socially deleterious effect. Right now, this is not across the board. I mean, go to Teaneck, New Jersey, right? Which is Teaneck, New Jersey is the capital of acculturated modern Orthodoxy, right? And in Teaneck, you can find every kosher cuisine under the sun. Okay, everything under the sun, right? But that's Teaneck, and that they don't have that ethos that says, well, we got to have one restaurant because people travel on it, right? Because also any community, I think the sort of the level and quality of kosher restaurants depends obviously on the size of the community, but also on how many people are Balei Tshuva, right? In other words, if you grew up eating crappy pizza and crappy kosher Chinese, you're satisfied with crappy pizza and crappy kosher Chinese, right? If you grew up eating everything under the sun and now you're Orthodox, you want kosher versions of the same thing, right? But the question of orthodoxy and culture is complicated. It is complicated, but I do think, I mean, I see, and I'm certainly not the first person or the most profound, but orthodoxy in America is moving to the right, and is moving in a more isolationist move. But on the other hand, is why you have, places like Yeshiva Hovei Torah, which is a conscious rebellion against that move to the right. You have Hadar, which is egalitarian. I mean, there's a lot going on, but these are either insurgents within Orthodoxy or people who have left Orthodoxy because they're not comfortable with their right-wing move. And I don't necessarily mean politically right-wing, although that can often go hand in hand with religiously right-wing as well. Judy?
So I'm wondering on a different part of what we spoke about the Supreme Court decision. And so to me, and please, everybody correct me, when I think of that, it says to me that the state should think it's okay if children don't get an education.
Well, I mean, that was this was 1972. So,
So it hasn't been brought up yet. I mean, certainly, I don't know what this Supreme Court would say.
Well, I mean, I think this Supreme Court would not be inclined to reverse it. I mean, if anything,
Probably
they'd be
not.
inclined to
Right.
strengthen. But I
You
don't
know-
know, but yeah, Alan, go ahead.
That's very much in line with the Dodd decision. It's a local issue. The states make the call. The federalism there's a certain umbrella, but it's a state issue. And that would be the Amish. The Amish may be different in another state. People may have different opinions, but the bare minimum for an education, I'm glassing over, and it's been a while since I read that decision. But the bare minimum was the 8th grade. That's a traditional level in the United States anyway, way back when.
Right. Are
So,
they
yeah.
testing? Are they, all right, 8th grade level, are they testing at an 8th grade level? One wonders.
I don't, I mean, I don't know. I don't, I lived across the river from Lancaster for 4 years, but I don't know, I don't know.
But then the federal government doesn't have to give money.
Right, but they don't take money. That's the difference. But the Amish schools don't take.
Oh, no, I know, the Amish
Right.
schools don't.
Right,
but
no, and
our
the yeshivas,
schools
I mean,
do.
I forgot to mention, and this will be, the wrap up, is that yesterday in New York, the state commissioner of education found a specific Hasidic school called Arugas Habosim, which is a Satmar school. I mean, you can, if you know the community, you can tell by the name, but Arugas Habosim is the Satmar school, in violation of state standards that require them to provide a substantially equivalent education to the public schools. And they now have X amount of time to come up with a remedial program. Okay, and this has nothing to do with whether they get state money or not. I mean, even if you don't get state money, there are certain minimum standards you have to meet. And I think what did happen is that this New York Times, I mean, the fact of the matter is pretty much everybody in New York, and as a Democrat who grew up in New York, I can say this because we're dealing with New York Democratic politicians, but they look the other way because the Hasidic community has a lot of clout, right? And the New York Times article sort of put pressure on them to stop looking the other way. And again, as Yogi Berra once said, another great New Yorker, although not Jewish, making predictions is very difficult, especially about the future. And so how this will play out, I don't know, but this is the first time that a Hasidic school has been found to be out of compliance and required to come up with a remediation program. So we'll see. All right. Good night, everybody.
Yashikava.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good
See ya.
night. Very good.
Thank you.
Night. Thank you.
See ya.